often confused when people like myself are called climate change deniers by the very people who actually seem to deny climate change unless it's being changed by man. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to explain to you the 4.5 billion year history of Earth, and in particular, its relationship to CO2. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. In that time, there have been 5 ice ages. The Huronian, 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago. But then there was a gap of 1250 million years, followed by the Cryogenian, 850 to 635 billion years ago. That was the second ice age. Then with a shorter gap of 175 billion years, and it was in this gap that the Cambrian period started. That was the age when underneath the oceans the whole of life exploded. It was the beginning of all the higher forms of life on Earth. At this time, the CO2 levels were between 5,000 and 7,000 parts per million, 15 times higher than today. But life in the oceans boomed, so much for making the seas more acidic. Yet it was the shells that grew on animals big and small that when they died got buried, and with them they started to bury the CO2, though the life gas of CO2 then was high. But over the ages to come, it was to get buried and buried and buried, and in the end, risk the very idea of life on Earth. Now we'll continue our historic journey. Next was the Andean-Saharan Ice Age, which lasted just 30 million years, to be followed by a gap of 70 million years. We then entered the Karoo Ice Age, one that lasted 100 million years, and during that time, that ice age sucked out more and more CO2 from the atmosphere. In a period known as the Carboniferous, 359 to 298 million years ago, where the trees that were growing died but couldn't be eaten by the bugs because the bugs hadn't wised up yet how to eat them, and therefore they got buried and formed the coal seams of today. In fact, all the coal seams in the world were formed in the Carboniferous period. Why? Because eventually the bugs wised up, learned how to eat the trees, and so when they fell down, they decomposed and didn't get buried anymore to form the coal seams. And after the Karoo Ice Age, there was a gap of over 257 million years, and during that gap, the supercontinent of Pangaea started to break up, and in breaking up, that continent caused an enormous amount of volcanic activity, pumping enormous amounts of CO2 into the air, increasing the level of CO2 in the atmosphere to between 1,500 and 2,800 parts per million, and thus rescuing life on Earth, at least, as we shall see, for a while. Finally, we reach the Quaternary, the final ice age, and the ice age we live in now. But keep in mind that over the last 260 million years or so, under 3 million years has been an ice age. For the rest of the time, there's been no polar ice caps at all, neither in the Antarctic or the Arctic. Remember, as long as we have ice at the poles, we are in this Quaternary ice age. But there are glaciations within that ice age. And before I move on to that, just look at the history of CO2 that I've covered so far. But see here, as we came out of the Cambrian ice ages, with CO2 levels above 4,000 parts per million, and we see a rise and fall of CO2 levels. As the different ice ages, cold water sucked in the CO2 from the atmosphere, and in addition to that, the burying of life that had captured the CO2, that continual burying gave a downward trend to the CO2. So gradually, until the Triassic here, we were suffering less and less CO2. The Triassic increased it here, and then after that increase, the gradual decline started again. And if we had not done anything to increase CO2, by the time the Industrial Revolution came, we were down to 285 parts per million. Continuing that trend would mean that we'd reach the 150 parts per million within 2 million years, and life on Earth would cease to exist. But now we're going to look at a smaller period. We're going to first look at 400,000 years the last 400,000 years, to see how CO2 and temperatures behave. This is the Earth, viewed from the North Pole downwards. It shows the extent of the glaciation some 400,000 years ago, and I'm going to take you in time through that 400,000 years to the present day. To make it easier to understand, I'm highlighting where the UK is. I'm leaving a red dot there. And I'm also labelling the USA. And now I'm adding the temperatures throughout this period. By definition, as long as we have ice at the poles, we are still in an ice age. And what we have here is glaciations within the ice age with short warm climates between them. We're in one now. What I'm going to do now is take you from 400,000 years ago through the glaciations right up to the present. As you can see, the Earth's climate goes through major changes every 100,000 years or so. And besides those major climatic changes every 100,000 years or so, there's also lots of smaller climatic changes, all those jagged mountains. And don't forget, we live in a tiny portion of that. Remember, as the ice changes, the amount of ice at the poles changes, so do the sea levels and the contours of all this land. This period here, known as the Eemian, was a much warmer period than we are currently in. It had lower CO2 levels as well. The very last glaciation finished about 20,000 years ago, and that's the one that had half a mile of ice over Birmingham and a lot of New York under a lot of ice. So this warm peak here is the period we're in now, and it started about 11,000 years ago and is called the Holocene. Now the graph I'm using here is based on this graph. It's actually an 800,000 year graph, and I'm just taking the last 400,000 years of it, but by expanding it like this, at the bottom you can see the source for the data I'm using. But we are only going to look at the last 400,000 years when there's been more and more glaciations, and in particular the last one here, well, that's when you got the half a mile of ice over Birmingham and lots of ice over New York. Now all this data is lifted from ice cores, and the thing to note is that the blue line there, the CO2 line, follows the temperature. So as the oceans warm up due to other factors, they give off the extra CO2, just like robbing up a can of Coca-Cola gives off the CO2, and they follow. So the oceans contain about 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere, and so as soon as they start to warm, they increase the CO2, so the CO2 always follows the rise in temperature. It isn't the cause of it. The big thing to note here is that these little periods where we go into the warm above the blue line, they're relatively infrequent. They last about 10 to 15,000 years, and we are now in one, and the one we're in is here. It's called the Holocene, and we're already about 11,000 years into it, with the norm being in the region of 10 to 15,000 years. So we haven't got long to go before we actually enter the next glaciation. And that, viewers, is the bad news. We are heading for a glaciation, and we don't know when it's going to come. But let's now zoom into that Holocene period we're in and have a look at that. Now this graph is just that 11,000 years, how into this gap in the glaciations. And it's the time, of course, when civilization as we know it grew. We have three graphs here. The black one is the temperature through the Holocene period, and the reference to the papers printed on the graph there. The red one is the CO2 levels throughout this period, and the blue one is the CH4 levels throughout this period. That's methane. So just look first at the black ones, and look at this average curve, the purple curve. We've come out of the glaciation here and hit peak temperature, and then gradually, and there's been wobbles in it caused by various cycles, but gradually that temperature's declined and declined. And it is that decline that we're now in. We're now here, just past the Little Ice Age. And of course, we're just heading straight into the next glaciation period. On the way down this slide into the next glaciation, we of course have the previous warm periods. For example, the Roman warm period here, and the medieval warm period here. Our current warm period is, of course, now, but that's coming to an end. Of course, there are many other cycles within this data, hence the jagged nature of it. For example, the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, which is the warming and cooling of the North Atlantic. That's got a period of 60 to 80 years. Below this video, you'll find a link to one or two videos about these cycles. But overall, there is no getting away from this slide into the next glaciation. So what can we learn from this graph? Well, just look at the red line, that's the CO2 level. Look at how it rises up from this really low level here. Well, as you're coming out of the very cold water of the previous glaciation, CO2 levels drop to around about 180 parts per million. Now, life really ceases to exist at 150 parts per million, and so we came very near to really extinction of life on Earth at that point, just 30 parts per million above the minimum. But nevertheless, as the oceans warmed, obviously they gave off more CO2. So you can see this rapid rise here in CO2 up to this point. That wasn't caused by mankind, of course. This is 11,000 years ago. So tracing along both the temperature curve here, and as you can see, the temperature curve rose, plateaued out, and then gradually started this decline towards the next glaciation. But at the same time, as it was at those high temperatures, much higher than today, the CO2 levels were much lower than today. Here, when the temperatures were highest, the CO2 was low. Yes? And then as you come along here, with all those high temperatures, the temperatures start to seriously drop, the CO2 goes higher. But we've got dropping temperatures with higher CO2, the exact opposite of what the alarmists claim. And the same arguments there for the methane as well. So there's no relationship whatsoever between the CO2 and the actual temperatures. It's actually cause and effect is the wrong way round with the alarmists. So that is that situation. And this basically shows, without any doubt at all, and I've given all the publishers of each of those curves on there so you can look them up if you wish to. All the papers that give that data, it's all combined in one graph here. But that's where we are. Now we are heading into the next glaciation, right? So overall, we're going to be cooling. And if you think about it, I don't think anyone here in the UK is moaning about the weather being too hot. But it's already reached the alarmist levels, apparently, to the alarmists. It's already reached 1.5, 1.6. I can't see you all sweltering and complaining about the heat. Weather does vary, but climate is weather over a long time. You have to look at that and don't mix up weather and climate. And that's what the alarmists do.